Hello and welcome to the EDH Academy podcast. My name is Jay, and I will be your host as we continue to explore the format known as Commander. I thank you for joining me for episode 2 of a Tuesday bi-weekly podcast where we discuss a wide range of topics within the Commander format, from deck strategies and how to counter them, upcoming sets and what they're going to mean for the format, as well as any rule or ban list changes that are going to affect how you build your deck and what strategy you use. In a bit of community spotlight, we'd like to congratulate the YouTube channel Highlander Havoc for having surpassed their 500 subscriber milestone. Great job, you guys, and keep up the good work. Be sure to check out their channel on YouTube and be sure to follow them on Twitter. They are both under Highlander Havoc. In a bit of Magic news, the Battle Bond set, the two-headed giant draft-only set, has fully been spoiled. The cards will be legal for Commander upon its release on June 8th, and there is a lot of sweet cards in that set. From some reprints, such as Doubling Season and Mycosynthellatus, to a full series of new partner commanders, where they are paired with a certain other legendary creature. The set looks really great for Commander, and I will be reviewing the entire set in a upcoming episode, so keep your eye out for that. And another piece of Commander news specifically, the Rules Committee has announced a rule change and a Commander ban list change for the dual Commander format. Effective June 1st, Zergo Bellstriker will now be banned as a Commander only. You can still run him in the 99, but you cannot run him as your Commander. For those who may not know who Zergo Bellstriker is a Orc Warrior legendary creature that has 2 power and toughness for 1 red mana. Its drawback is that it can't block creatures with power 2 or greater, but it also has the Mardu mechanic of dash, where you can pay its dash cost, and if you do, it gains haste, and at the end of the turn, it goes back to your hand. Zergo Bellstriker being banned as Commander is a way for the Rules Committee to kind of balance out the fact that Dual Commander was once at 30 life, was then reduced to 20 life, which showed a surge in aggressive strategies. Zergo Bellstriker being able to be a 2/2 that comes down on turn 1, which is quite an advantageous thing for a aggressive deck to have, especially in the very early game. The Rules Committee for Dual Commander is also announcing a change to the rules called the Commander Swap Rule. What that means is that players are allowed to swap commanders after each game during the same round, because Dual Commander normally is a best 2 out of 3. So after the first game played each round, each player may shuffle his or her commander into his or her deck and present either the same one or new commanders from the deck as long as the color identity does not change. I feel this is a healthy rule change for the format because it allows players to adjust their strategy a little bit as far as what they have access to for the game, because even though their color identity is not changing, the cards in their deck are not changing. Certain commanders are a bit more aggressive than others, some are a little bit more control-based than others, and I feel that it's a very strong thing to have, especially in a format where you don't have access to sideboards. You're not allowed to actually change the composition of your deck, but being able to switch around your commanders, I feel, is a very healthy change for the format. So even though you have to be running that legendary creature in your main deck in order to swap it out, I feel this change is a overall positive change for the format. And now onward to the main topic of today's podcast. If you joined us last week, we discussed what the Commander format is and what are the general deck building restrictions within that format. So to recap, you have 1 legendary creature that stays in your command zone. You're able to cast it from the command zone, but you have to pay 2 more each time you cast it from there. Your deck has to then consist of cards of basic lands, 1 copy of each non-basic land card or each non-land card that fit within your commander's color identity, and the total between the cards in your command zone and the cards in your main deck have to total 100. So now that we know that, the next step is, well, let's actually get a deck. Let's build a deck. Let's actually play some games and learn about this format. When it comes to deck building, there is a mental aspect to it and a physical aspect to it. The mental aspect deals more with deck strategy and knowing what your deck is wanting to do and figuring out a way to get you to either winning the game or just closing out the game. The physical component of it is dealing with how many of certain cards are within your deck, synergies between the interactions of multiple cards, as well as prioritizing what cards are going over which based on utility, based on what their cost is, based on what you actually get out of the card itself. So to talk about the mental aspect of it first, because the mental aspect is what drives the deck composition portion of it, the first question that you want to answer is, how do I want my deck to win? Do I want to develop a large board state of creatures and attack my opponents for the game? Do I want to make one creature really big and be able to take out an opponent with 1 or 2 attacks? Do I want to be dealing non-combat damage through a variety of mechanisms to eliminate my opponents that way? Do I want to use the infect mechanic to just deal 10 poison counters to a player and get them out of the game? Maybe you want to use one of Magic's many different instant win strategies to win the game, or you want to cause your opponents to lose the game by not being able to draw a card for the turn. There are many different strategies to win the game. There is no one correct way. There are some strategies that may be stronger depending on how many opponents you have versus others. There may be some that are easier to build for you versus others, but at the end of the day, your deck will need at least to know what it wants to do to be able to close out the game and ultimately cause you to win. The second thing to be keeping in mind regarding the mental aspect of deck building is ensuring that your deck is built to actually win the game. There is a difference between wanting you as the player to win the game and your deck being built to help you win the game. Sometimes we end up in a situation to where we're trying to build a commander deck, we see a legendary creature, think it's great, and then we just start doing research on a series of cards that work well with that commander or with that commander strategy. And that's exactly what you want to be doing when it comes to commander. You want to be looking into those things, you want to be ensuring that the synergies are there, but sometimes we get so excited and so focused on ensuring that the cards synergize with the commander that we lose sight of the fact that the deck is just kind of reacting to the commander, but it's not pushing hard enough to be able to close out the games, cause you to win the games, and, move on to the next one, which is ultimately what you are out to do. Being able to determine whether or not a card is good for your strategy may take some time, and it's very well possible that the cards you pick aren't exactly going to be the strongest for your deck when you first pick them. And this is actually okay. This is actually part of the growing process and part of the deck building process, because as you play your deck, you begin to learn what you actually like about this commander, what you don't like about the deck itself, what you don't like about the commander, and it gives you a better idea of how it is living, how it's breathing, how it operates. And in that way, you're able to decide for yourself, okay, this one card is not doing it for me anymore. This isn't doing what I thought it would end up doing, and I need to take this out. The third aspect of the mental component of deck building is keeping in mind of a way for your deck to be able to either close out the game with your victory, or to lock out the game for your opponents within a single turn, or a series of turns depending on how your deck operates. The reason why you want to keep this in mind is because there are going to be times in a game where you play in a while and you've done some good things, your deck may be operating either at just below optimal or right at optimal, and you've been playing the game for an extended period of time, and you just want this game to end, you need this game to finish, or your opponent has presented an opportunity to where you either finish the game now, or your opponent is either going to get so far ahead that you can't keep up or overcome it, or your opponent will just end up winning the game. So you need to be thinking about ways that your deck can finish out a game within a single turn if it has the opportunity to do so. Am I suggesting that you build your deck entirely to ensure that in that one moment in time you're able to grab the right pieces, be able to put them on board, and take the rest of the table out? Absolutely not. That type of narrow-minded deck building is what's going to keep you from actually being able to operate in the game, because you're going to be so focused on ensuring that that outcome comes out that you're not going to be thinking about all the other encounters and all the different things you may end up dealing with in your game. What I'm saying is that keep in mind of what your deck is trying to do. Think about how it wants to win the game, and think about a way to ensure that if you only have one turn to do it, how can you ensure that either you win the game that turn, or to ensure that by the end of that turn, your opponents can't win the game? So now that we have established the type of mindset that we want to be using going into deck building, let's actually start talking about what you're going to want to have in your deck. Regardless of your strategy, regardless of your game plan, you need to make sure to have these things within your deck. And after mulling it over and thinking about it, I've narrowed it down to 5 different categories that need to be looked into and ensure that they're balanced. Those 5 categories are land balance, mana acceleration, strategy acceleration, interaction, and utility. So by land balance, I mean you have to make sure that you're running enough lands to where you are drawing an equal mix between spells and lands, and that you're able to draw enough lands to be able to cast the spells that are coming up in your hand. When you're running multicolor decks, this land balance is super crucial because not only do you need to make sure that you're drawing enough lands, but you also need to make sure that you're drawing enough sources of the colors that you're running to ensure that if you draw a multicolor spell or you're drawing a mix of colors of spells, that you are able to cast those spells regardless of timing and tempo. So that means running lands that, even though they may come into battlefield tapped, they're able to tap for multiple colors, or they give you access to multiple colors so that you're able to cast these spells. You're not waiting to draw into the basic lands that adds the color that you need. Now, as far as land balance goes for decks in general, obviously if you're running a higher average of converted mana costs in your deck, you need to be running more lands. The reason why we like to look at the average converted mana cost for a given spell within our decks is because it gives us an idea of how many lands we're going to want to have on hand in order to cast the spells that we're running. So if our converted mana cost average is around 3, 3.5, or 4, somewhere in that ballpark, we're going to want to make sure to be running a higher concentration of lands to ensure that at any moment in time we're able to draw into a safe number of lands to be able to play them and be able to cast those spells. Now, obviously, if you're running a lower converted mana cost deck, maybe closer in the range of 2, maybe even a little under 2, it's going to be okay to not be running as many lands because there are going to be cards that you're running to already help you get to your end game and to complete out your strategy without necessarily having to run the same number of lands as those with a higher converted mana cost. The second category that I had mentioned is that of mana acceleration. Mana acceleration is when you are giving yourself access to more mana outside of your 1 land per turn. So having access to mana acceleration will allow you to be able to play higher costing spells earlier and allow you to get your strategy online quicker, so that way you can end up ahead of your opponents and be able to close out the game before your opponents really have a chance to answer to what you're dealing with, or forcing them to answer to what you're dealing with early, possibly burning out some removal spells or interaction spells in their hand to deal with what you're doing. As far as how many you should run, there are many who say you should be averaging anywhere between 8 to 10 mana acceleration cards. So this can come in the form of creatures that tap to add mana, artifacts that tap to add mana, or even creatures or artifacts or enchantments that search for lands out of your deck and put them onto the battlefield. A few examples of creatures that do that are Burnished Heart and Solemn Simulacrum. I know some may not be able to afford Solemn Simulacrum always, but Burnished Heart is always a good one to go to. Even though it has an activation cost to do it, getting those 2 lands from it is super valuable. The third category, which we're going to be talking about, is strategy acceleration. Now, it's going to sound a lot like a section for card drawing specifically, but I labeled it as strategy acceleration because I feel that card draw, while it's going to be included in this section, is not entirely end-all be-all. Yes, drawing cards gives you access to more cards and therefore more options as far as what spells you're casting per turn, and gives you more variety to work with ahead of your opponents, but I feel that cards that will search your deck for pieces that you are going to want to use is equally as important, and I feel could serve the similar slot. So for strategy acceleration, again, we're looking at 8 to 10 pieces of card draw, which could be in sorcery instant form, creature form. We're talking about 8 to 10 sources of strategy acceleration, so that could be in creature form, that could be in sorcery and instant form, artifact, enchantment form. What we're looking for is a way to be able to either draw cards from your deck or search your library for cards that are going to accelerate your strategy to eventually win the game. The fourth category in question is that of interaction. I labeled it interaction because interaction is where you are dealing with things that your opponent is doing. Either it is a creature on board, an artifact, enchantment on board, whether it's a spell they're casting, it is interacting with something your opponent is doing. And this is actually a very crucial part of every deck building, regardless of what format you're playing, because In the off chance that your opponent does get ahead of you in the game or is trying to get ahead of you in the game, you need to be able to have access to the answers to those things that they're trying to do. Whether it's them attempting to swarm the board with creatures and attack you out, whether they're playing the one enchantment that's turning off your entire strategy, you need to be able to get in there and deal with that option there. Now, there are two forms of interaction that we're going to be discussing there. One of them is single interaction and one is wide interaction. With single interaction, we're dealing with one permanent or one spell. So these are your counter spells, these are your instants that destroy artifacts and enchantments, these are your creatures entering the battlefield to do the same thing. These are cards like Oblivion Ring and Banishing Light that exile a permanent, exile a non-land permanent until they leave the field. These are the things that are going to deal with one thing in particular. Now, it's important to have these because it is a one-off spell or one-off creature effect that will get rid of it for good. The second one being wide interaction. This is also important because a player may be getting ahead of the game so much so that to try and come back and deal with the problems individually is not only not going to be cost effective, but it may just prove to be an uphill battle that you just cannot win. So having some sources in your deck that deal with things on a wide level is also super important. Some sources out there say you should be running 4 to 5 pieces of single interaction and 4 to 5 pieces of wide interaction. While some people say you should be running 4 to 5 sources of single interaction and 4 to 5 sources of wide interaction, I feel that the combined number of about 9 to 10 is right around where you're going to want to be. Some colors don't support as much wide interaction as they do single interaction and vice versa. So as long as you're in that 9 to 10 of you responding to what your opponents are doing, you should at least have a solid foundation from there. You may be changing the numbers depending on what your meta does, but getting around to 9 to 10 is where you're going to want to be. The last category that we're going to be talking about is that of utility. Now, utility is the last slot that you're going to want to fulfill because it is the most variable and has the most that can change within it. I created this section for the basis of deck building because you are going to need to be able to either grant yourself a certain benefit, mainly infinite hand size, that may not be included in what your strategy is going for, but you also need to be able to include some things that are dealing with your particular meta. Now, if you don't know the opponents that you're going to be going up against, this section here may only have about 4 or 5 slots of your deck, and that's strictly to either give you a specific benefit or to set your opponent back in some way, shape, or form. If you know your meta, however, you know what decks you're going to be facing up against, you're going to want to use these 4 or 5 slots to put in cards that specifically deal with those strategies. If you know you're going to be facing against a particular strategy or multiple players with that same strategy, you could take away from some of your single removal or a little bit of your strategy acceleration to be able to run those cards to handle that strategy, because I know you're going to want to be able to deal with that quickly and effectively, so having most of those slots taken care of right there is going to be what you're going to want to do. To summarize, the things you're going to want to be considering when you're building a deck are going to be what your deck wants to do, the mana resources you give yourself both in land and in non-land form to be able to cast those spells as soon as possible and resolve your strategy as quickly as possible, and also how many pieces of interaction and counter strategy you're going to be running, so that way if your opponent attempts to get ahead or is preventing you from being able to use your strategy, you'll be able to properly respond to what they're doing and be able to propel forward and keep going with your strategy, so that way you can go out and close the game. And that is going to do it for us here on the second episode of the EDH Academy podcast. We'd like to thank Planeswalker Project on YouTube for designing our sweet podcast logo. I'd like to thank everyone on Twitter who participated and retweeted my recent poll about the maximum number of colors a first EDH deck should include if a player is looking to start out on the format and solidify the foundation of strategy and how the format plays out. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in 2 weeks' time.